Now we are going to see literary criticism. In literary criticism, we are going to see about Aristotle. Aristotle, he belonged to the age 384 to 322 BC. He belonged to the classical period and he is known as a philosopher. And his age was flourishing in arts, philosophy, and science. And he belonged to the city called Athens, which is the center of Greek culture, which was thriving in democracy and it was fostering in artistic expressions such as drama, sculpture, and architecture. He was a student of Plato and he was often debated with his teacher's idealistic theories. He advocated for a more practical and empirical approach to knowledge. His teacher, Plato, he criticized poetry for its emotional appeal, whereas Aristotle, he replied that poetry is the artistical form of the truth. Aristotle, he defended the value of poetry and the role in human life. He said that poetry should be both appealing to mind as well as the heart. Plato, in his work Republic, he stated that poetry should only be influencing the ideas of mind, where in turn Aristotle, he defended in the work Poetics that poetry should appeal to the mind as well as the heart. As a student of Socrates, Plato, he blindly believed that poetry is misleading a man away from truth. On the contrary, Aristotle, as a student of Plato, he said that poetry is something which has the capacity to do something good to a human being. The primary works of Aristotle includes Poetics and Rhetoric. The work Poetics, it focuses on the art of poetry. He emphasized tragedy in the work Poetics, how a work should be, how a poetry should be, how a tragedy should be. In the work of rhetoric, he explores the art of persuasion and its ethical and emotional aspects. For example, ethical and emotional aspects includes the moral and the uh, emotional appeal of the art which is used in a work. And Aristotle followed analytical, logical, and systematic criticism. Analytical, for of course, is analyzing a work in an intellectual perspective. Logical is something which should make some sense. Systematic is nothing but having a proper form, structure for a work. He believed that the literary works should be more of artistical expressions rather than a theory. He said that a work must contain literary principles and frameworks to apply it across the genres to get what we want. His plan of analytical, logical, and systematic is, for example, if we take Othello, we could see that Othello, a king who has a fallen kingdom because of his tragic flaw. It is logical and it is analytical, and that whole Othello play is systematic. Aristotle, he personally believed that every drama or every tragedy should have a systemic framework in order to attain its fulfillment. And in his work Rhetoric, the word persuasion implies that a work of art should actually persuade a human being to change him from inside, from the emotional aspects as well as the moral aspects of a human being. And his observations on poetry, actually, he told the world that poetry is nothing but the imitation of art. Every poet in this world has to imitate what is happening around him, what is happening before him, what is happening in his life. So he said that a work of art must be the analysis of what is happening inside or around or surrounded by him. The exact word for poetry is the imitation of life. And he stated that through genres, whatever the genre may be, whether a work may be tragedy or comedy, it should imitate life. And he discussed on the general observations on poetry. In the book called Poetics, he said that poetry as an imitation, mimesis, the imitation of life. He categorized poetry into epic, tragedy, comedy, and so many other forms. He said that the tragedy, it is mainly focuses on the structure, elements and purpose. And the genres, he explores between tragedy, epic and comedy. And he emphasizes on the importance of language, metaphors and clarity in poetry. Why does he say so? Because when someone imitates on life, it should be aesthetically beautiful. When someone imitates what is happening around them, they should not just imitate what it is there as it is, but to add some artistic observations on there. Those artistic observations will add more beauty to the poetry. He states about the nature of poetry that he defined mimesis as an imitation of life, human emotions, and actions. He reflects on the universal truth rather than historical events, and he distinguishes poetry from history. First of all, what is history? The things which has happened in the past. And he sets a meter that a poetry is the possible outcomes which is gonna happen or which was already happened on the past. He sets poetry on the top level and he distinguishes between history and poetry. He states that the poetry captures the possible and the universal things, while history records the particular incidents. What we learn if one World War One is if a World War One is recorded, it is called history. But the life of a woman who lost her husband in the World War One, it is a poem. So Aristotle, he sets a difference between what is poetry and what is history. According to Aristotle, the function of poetry is to educate and to entertain. He states that the catharsis, which means the purification of emotions, is by invoking the deepest emotions of a human being from the inside. That is the pity and the fear. While reading Romeo and Juliet, we could sense the fear of losing the Romeo in Juliet's heart and the fear of losing Juliet in Romeo's heart. So we could see the pity and fear arousing in the hearts of human being while seeing or while reading Romeo Juliet, or while reading Othello. We could see that pity of being Desdemona, who was killed by her own husband. We could see that how pity she was and how dreadful Othello was to kill Desdemona in the name of unfaithfulness. And we could see that each and every tragedy it involves in arousing the emotions inside us. The moral reflection and emotional balance could only be achieved only if then emotion is completely purified. Aristotle firmly states that it the tragedy, the forms among all forms, only tragedy it arouses a human being's emotion completely, and it is the purest form of poetry. And Aristotle's observation on tragedy, he said that tragedy is rooted in religious rituals, which is a particular thing that a human being follows. He states that the dramatized story they focus on human conflict, which is none other than the things which is happening inside and outside a human being. We could take Hamlet as an example. We could see how Hamlet was traumatized from the ghost and how he had delivered the whole drama followed by that ghost's voice. We could see how Hamlet suffered the conflict of Hamlet in the play Hamlet. We could see how Othello suffered in the play Othello. We could see how Macbeth and Lady Macbeth was plunged to death in the play Macbeth. And we could see in Romeo Juliet how Romeo and Juliet were destined to die at their own hands. All these things, Aristotle states that all these things it focuses on a human conflict, whether it may be a sibling rivalry, whether it may be for love, whether it may be two families conflict, whether it may be a conflict within a human being, it always focuses on a human conflict. He states that tragedy is nothing but only if it happens inside a human being. Otherwise, the readers who are reading it or the audience who sees it cannot get the fulfillment of the tragedy. No one could attain their top notch of watching a tragedy unless they feel a sympathy towards it. Aristotle firmly believes that the tragedy should be rooted in human conflict in order to connect with the other human being. Aristotle he states about the characteristics of a tragedy. First is serious action. As I already said, it deals with profound human issues. Like we could take example of so many Shakespearean plays, or we could take Ben Jonson's plays, or we could take Dr. Faustus. It is all rooted in human issues, and a tragedy should contain a complete and a unified plot, which is a tragedy should start from a rising action where a king or a man of a noble birth could attain all the things, like he attained a kingdom, he has a love of his life, or he has the kingdom, he won a war, and to the peak of it there comes a change of plot. There happens the inside issue of the human being. In the falling action, we could see that he loses his kingdom, he loses his wife, or he loses the entire throne, or he at last he loses his life. This is known as the narrative segment of a tragedy, a beginning, a middle, and the end. All these three constitutes the complete and a unified plot. And third thing, magnitude. What is magnitude? Magnitude is nothing but the amount of feelings elevated during a scene, which is for example, to elevate the emotional appeal of a human being, we need certain scenes. For example, if we take Romeo and Juliet, at the very last scene, where Romeo comes and sees the dead body of Juliet, he cries a lot. He didn't know that Juliet was acting, and she drank a potion, and for a quite while she is lying down. He doesn't know that. What he knows is Juliet is dead. On the other hand, when Juliet wakes up and sees Romeo dead, she was devastated. These are the magnitude which is needed to elicit the emotional impact in a drama. And Shakespeare handles it so well, we call him the king of tragedy actually. And we are skipping on to artistic language. What is artistic language? Artistic language is nothing but a tragedy should comprises of characters who are of noble birth, and so they have to speak in a noble language in order to showcase their level. Artistic language is needed to acquire rhythm or harmony, or for the dramatic effect we also use chorus. Language is very important for any play, especially for tragedy actually. In comedy, the characters may of laymen or the common people who used to work in an mime or something. Their language need not to be skillfully crafted, as they could use the colloquial language. But that is not the case in tragedy. Tragedy needs some artistic language to elevate their status, to elevate their level, to bring in rhythm. We need some sort of rhythmic meters, and we need songs for the dramatic effect. We need chorus to indicate something good or something bad is going to happen. So, language is another important characteristic of a tragedy. And catharsis, last but not least, catharsis is nothing but the emotional purification of an audience. Why do we need catharsis? Because it is important in tragedy that their emotions are purified, their emotions are being sucked out by the drama. A perfect drama should evoke the pity or fear inside a human being to give them a moral and an ethical balance in their life. They should think that if a king or a nobleman who is high born, if they make a simple mistake like that and they can fall down, what about us as the human beings? And next, we are shifting to the constituent parts of a tragedy. First thing is plot, and its Greek name is mythos. Plot is the arrangement of incidents central to the drama. Like, if a plot should start from a boy who's born and who's developing from a child to a boy to a man to a king, and then king who rules and who dies, it is the arrangement of incidents in a human being. A plot is very important part of a tragedy. Next important constituent part is character. Character, ethos. It should reflect a moral purpose. Othello, though he is a black man, he is called as a Moor, he is a man of a dignified character. He loved only Desdemona, and he didn't even allow any other woman to be in his life. Romeo, on the other hand, even though he loved Rosalind before, after when Juliet came, he dedicated his whole life to Juliet. And it reflects his moral purpose of a character, and those are the characteristic features of a nobleman. And the third one is thought, dianoia. It expresses the themes, argument, and philosophies we are gonna deal with the play, which is nothing but if a man of a certain birth is gonna do a fatal flaw and if he dies, what about a general human being? So, the thought, the central theme is very much important for a tragedy. and it marks a great part of a tragedy. The fourth one is diction lexis, the use of language to convey the meaning effectively. As I said before, language is very important part of a tragedy and use of words is also pretty much important. The fifth part of a tragedy is song melophia, which enhances the emotional experience of a tragedy. And the last but not least is a spectacle, the visual representation secondary to the intellectual aspects. Let me comment a few on this. Why a spectacle is important actually. Apart from emotional presentation, apart from emotional awakening, visual presentation is actually pretty much important. Why? Because if a play is happening in a forest, it must happen in a forest. If a play is happening in a kingdom, it must happen in a kingdom. So, a spectacle or opsis is very much important part of a tragedy. Next, we are shifting to the structure of a plot. The structure of a plot contains unified actions, which means following all three unities. What are the all three unities? Unity of place, unity of time, and unity of action. What is unity of action? If a play is a tragedy, all characters or all incidents in a play should contribute to the same action, which is tragedy. If a play is a comedy, all the incidents and all the characters should contribute to the same theme, comedy. That is unity of action. What is unity of time? If a play happens in a 24 hours, it should happen in 24 hours. There is no such thing as after 12 years or after 24 hours in a play. It may confuse the audience or the readers who is sitting in front and covering the play in a very short time. And unity of place. Unity of place is nothing but if an action is gonna happen in a place, it should happen in that same place to avoid confusions for the audience. And it should avoid episodic plots where events are loosely connected. What Aristotle says here is if a plot has n number of episodic plots or subplots there and there, it may have confused the audience. So it is very much pretty important that a tragedy must be not loosely connected, but all the acts in the play must be connected in a way it should be easily understandable to the audience. And what is peripecia? It is the sudden change in fortune, which is nothing but if a character or the protagonist is being very good in the beginning and he has all the things he deserves, like a kingdom, a girl he loves, or whatever happens, at the peak of the play, there will be a sudden change in fortune. He will lose his kingdom, he will lose his girl, and at last he loses himself. It is very much important in a play. And what is recognition and anagorgosis? It is the moment of discovery. For example, we could take Othello. When Othello came to know that Desdemona was a pure soul, he felt it so bad and he killed himself. It is the moment of discovery that he was wrong. He misjudged the person he loved. When Juliet came to know about the Romeo is dead and her information was not properly conveyed to him on time, she felt devastated. It was the moment of her discovery. And these two things, the peripecia and anagosis, is very important for the tragedy. And Aristotle also talks about the tragic hero. He is of a noble birth or a high status. As I have told before, that he possesses a tragic flaw, which is nothing but hamartia, which lead to his downfall. We could see in so many plays that misjudging a person or with a misleading information or miscommunication, it leads to the downfall of the protagonist. And what are all the observations of style according to Aristotle? He states that appropriateness, a language should suit to the subject and the genre. For example, elevated style for tragedy and colloquial style for comedy. And clarity. He states that if a language is to be elevated, it should remain intelligible to the audience. It should not confuse audience at any point. And Aristotle, he firmly believes that use of metaphors is the hallmark of poetic language. He states that uh, like metaphors, it brings the vividness and the intellectual depth. If a person is compared to the moon, or if a person is compared to the swan, it brings out the exact qualities of a moon or a swan we know of. So the use of metaphor is one such appropriate style to use whenever a writer or a dramatist or a poet could express his artistic expression. And the use of metaphor also states his intellectual depth. Not only these three, he also states about comedy and also epic. He also states that the comedy should be the imitation of lower type, focusing on the ridicule part and not on the serious part. He states that the primary function of a comedy is to provoke laughter. He states that a critic should take comedy in a light-hearted manner. He states that a comedy should not need to follow the three unities as tragedy, and for every comedy play, it will actually end in an happy or a reconciliatory note, which means a comedy, according to Aristotle, is of happy one, a mirthful one, a light one, which could always end in a note that everyone in the play at last reconciliate with each other. They'll be happy. These are all the points on the observation of comedy by Aristotle. We could also see the observations on epic, like he states that an epic should have an heroic deeds and should focus on the particular or a significant event. He states that an epic is an exaggerated or an elevated work. He states that he sees a larger scope in tragedy than epic. He states that an epic should have a seriousness similar to tragedy, and also in epic he states that he has the freedom in narration and to have multiple episodes while talking about great things. Tragedy is more focused and intense, whereas epic is more focused on the heroic deeds and actions. Overall, he states about the tragedy, his observations on comedy, and his observations on epic. We could see all his observations in the book Poetics and his observation on style too. And we could now skip to his view of criticism. In Aristotle's Poetics, we could see that he provided a systemic framework for analyzing literature. He influenced critique for centuries. From 384 BC till 2024, Aristotle sets a benchmark for criticism. Using his views, we are still evaluating books based on his criticism. His observation on plot, character, and catharsis, it remains as a central to the literary studies. Many of the critics till now they are using Aristotle as a benchmark to critique any other work written by any other author. He was the one who laid foundation on how to analyze a work one by one. And we should all learn how to criticize a work without hurting the actual poet. And we now skipping to the impact of later criticism of Aristotle. After Aristotle, when the Renaissance and the neoclassical critics, they have adopted and they have expanded their theories on criticism. The concept like three unities, action, time and place, was introduced by him and it was used till now. A tragic hero, he was heavily influenced by the dramatic theory, was begun by him and it was used till now. Aristotle was the one who laid the foundation and he was the one who stated that without this format or without this structure, a work cannot be criticized. And what are all the relevance to modern criticism according to Aristotle? His insights on emotional appeal, universality, and moral purpose, it helps us to gain interpretation of literature and art. An emotional appeal may be different to me, may be different to another human being. I particularly states that emotional appeal is nothing but a work of art should relate to me, and then where is why I would connect myself to that work. And universality is nothing but a general thought which would connect to the all the people in the world. And the moral purpose, it continues to grow in a way that it has so many purpose and so many elements in a way of human being. And he emphasized on the structure and coherence in modern storytelling. What is a structure? A tragedy or comedy or an epic, according to Aristotle, must contain certain structures in order to deliver them, in order to connect with people even more easier. And he states that coherence is important. What is coherence? Connectivity. A connectivity from a human being to the targeted audience is not so easy. But according to his way of criticism, he states that a work of art should be easily coherent with each other. It should be coherent with the audience so that it may appeal to their emotional ability even more easier. And that's all about Aristotle and his literary criticism. Thank you.